Alberta Premier Jason Kenney recently announced the province's reopening plans. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, it looks like as long as COVID-19 hospitalization rates remain low and more Albertans are vaccinated against the virus, we should be fully open by, July?
Yeah, that's the target the government is aiming for. Premier Jason Kenney promised on Wednesday basically that Stampede's going to go ahead, that we are going to, have a summer, that everything's going to be great. So it's a three-stage plan. The first stage begins basically Friday actually with limits on the number of people who are allowed in church services going up to 15% of fire code occupancy. And then Monday is when it really gets rolling with, outdoor patios being reopened and things like that. And then, as you mentioned, it's all sort of contingent on vaccination numbers and hospitalization. So phase one is pinned at 50% of eligible people getting the first dose of their vaccine, which we cleared that on May 18th, I think. And then the second phase is 60%, and the third one is 70%. So things are coming along nicely on the vaccination front. And we'll just have to keep an eye on those hospitalization numbers to make sure they're still coming down.
And I noticed on social media too, people planning for weddings. That's good news for wedding parties as well. If they're having their wedding in August or September, there shouldn't be much of an issue, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's always the risk something could go wrong. Of course, former Premier Rachel Notley, I should say, raised some concerns in the legislature that this was going to be moving too fast, that it might put us at risk of a fourth wave. Now, the government, of course, responding by saying that, look, we've looked at the data in other countries, in Israel, the United Kingdom. This is based on the science and things like that. So it is a faster opening plan, I think it's fair to say, than other provinces. But the government seems pretty sure they've got the science right on this one.
And so many small business owners are more than happy and more excited. And I'm really excited to give them their business as well, to see them reopened. Tyler, the province has ordered the suspension of research links to China. The University of Lethbridge here, the U of C, the U of A, and Athabasca University must all report to the province within 90 days their ties to the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government. Tyler, let me ask you something. What ties would an Alberta university have with China?
Yeah, this seems to be in sort of research partnerships, whether it's a partnership with a firm in China or other universities in China. The government sort of wants to know whether or not there are any, not national security implications necessarily, but whether or not there's the risk of theft of technology, of research, things being developed by sort of the Chinese government or the Communist Party. So there are lots of partnerships going back quite some time between universities and other Chinese universities and research institutes. So the universities have said they're going to do this. They'll look into it and report back. But it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in regards to some of these older relationships that exist. The Li Ka-shing Institute at the University of Alberta, a big institute that's been involved in the fight against COVID-19, with research and things like that, that's funded by an entrepreneur in Hong Kong, which is, up until, recently was independent, but now really more and more part of China. So it's perhaps going to have some interesting implications for universities in the weeks and months and years to come.
I believe I heard as well from Minister Nicolaides, who was talking about the theft of intellectual property. That was a big concern as well. We all know what happened with Nortel way back when, so I can see why the government is really concerned about that. Alberta teachers recently passed a vote of non-confidence regarding Education Minister Adriana LaGrange. Tyler, does this really hold any weight, or is this, as the government says, just the union may be playing politics?
Yeah, it really doesn't mean much of anything, for better or for worse, I suppose. We saw this happen last summer, actually, with Health Minister Tyler Shandro. The doctors had sort of done a similar thing. But it was the Alberta Teachers Association convention over the weekend. So they talked about all sorts of things, including the draft curriculum, and they took this vote on LaGrange, and something like 99% of teachers said they didn't have confidence in her. So, of course, the New Democrats picking up on this, using it as a bit of a club against the United Conservatives, but they're saying, no, this is playing politics with our kids' future. This isn't a non-confidence vote that topples a government or something. They're just saying, no, we don't like the education minister very much and would perhaps like her to leave.
Let's talk about that new draft curriculum as well, which you said many teachers have rejected. But some Indigenous groups have also said that they felt betrayed after seeing more of the draft. Can you explain why?
This is a really interesting one. So, whenever criticism of the curriculum has come up, the United Conservatives have said they pointed to a handful of people who they've said have endorsed this curriculum. Now, there's a story this week that basically talked to these people and asked them, what their views were and whether or not they did in fact endorse it. And so there's sort of two things that happened there. The first is a couple people said that, look, we saw a summary of the curriculum and it sounded great, and so we endorsed that. And then a couple other people said, well, we received hundreds of pages of documents pertaining to the curriculum and had a day or two to respond. And so basically, what they're saying is, our endorsement of this is not really based on a full knowledge of the curriculum, and they said they feel like they're being tokenized by the government, being used to defend it. So a bit of an awkward situation the government's finding itself in. Of course, they are now pointing to the fact that this is a draft curriculum. This isn't the final curriculum. It's being piloted in a couple schools this fall, but still time for consultation, still time for modification, of course.
Tyler, the anti-Alberta Energy Inquiry has received yet another extension for filing its final report. This is what, the fourth extension since it was originally due last July? Why the delays?
It's really hard to say at this point. I mean, the energy inquiry is it's very secretive in a lot of ways. It's not covered by freedom of information requests that journalists often use to get information from government bodies. Steve Allen, the commissioner behind it, has not said very much. I believe they've sort of cited COVID as a reason for a delay over the course of the pandemic. But yeah, as you say, this is the fourth delay. This was such a big ticket item in the early days of the Kenney premiership that it's obviously fallen to the side during the pandemic. But it's been odd, I guess, to see the government sort of allowing it to keep getting pushed back, because I think, at least at this point, surely they want a win. And this might end up being that for them. This might be the sort of thing that helps fill the sails a little bit of some of their supporters. But on that front, there is a teeny tiny nugget of good news, which is that Eco Justice, the environmental law group, basically had gone to court to try and shut down the inquiry, saying it was brought in bad faith and was attacking charitable organizations, intimidating them, and tried to get it shut down, and it got tossed out of court. So, there's a little bit of a clearer path forward for the inquiry. At this point, at least, it's just a question of when they're actually going to finish their work.
Has the province found much proof as to the anti-Alberta energy sentiment that's out there by special interest groups?
Yeah, well, and that's hard to say, of course, because the government's been sort of repeating the claims made by Vivian Krause, a researcher, for a couple years, and that sort of formed part of the basis of this inquiry. And the government's been obviously saying this for a long time and citing some of that research. And so you have sort of two things happening, of course. On one hand, you could point to Krause's research and say, we already know all of this, so why are we doing this again? Or you could say, secondly, Krause's research maybe wasn't that good. We don't like her research, so why are we doing this? So it's a weird scenario all around, I would say, and the government has bits and pieces of evidence. But of course, I think they're looking for this sort of grand conspiracy narrative, which is obviously a little bit harder to dig up.
Tyler, the NDP is pushing for paid sick leave. Now, when the legislature resumed, NDP leader Rachel Notley and company tried to get an emergency debate on the subject, but it was promptly shot down by the UCP.
Yeah, that happened on Tuesday. So, of course, the NDP is really pushing this paid sick leave thing, even as we're sort of on our way out of the pandemic. And the UCP has been really reluctant and resistant to do it. Of course, we saw this debate play out in British Columbia and in Ontario as well. And so the NDP clearly thinks that they can make some political ground up on that. UCP hasn't done it. Kenney has referred to it as a jobs killing policy. Rachel Notley responded basically by saying that this is a life-saving policy, not a job-killing policy. It came up in question period on Wednesday a little bit. So it's, one of those issues that I don't think anything's going to happen on. Unless for some reason we get hit by a horrible fourth wave, I don't think we're going to see movement on it. But for the New Democrats, it's clearly a good political move to keep bringing it up.
The province reintroduced its turn off the taps bill, Tyler. Now, the original had a sunset clause and it expired. And this one apparently excludes gas and does not have an expiry date. Energy Minister Sonia Savage says, what, this is another way we can protect our resources?
Yeah, I admit I was caught off guard when that was introduced this week because I was like, we already have this. So what's going on here? But that's basically the gist of it. They are reintroducing it because it expired, and it's broadly similar, other than sort of an exclusion for refined petroleum products, so gasoline basically. But we'll see if it ever gets used, of course, because it hasn't been used. But that tool is sitting in the toolbox.
Yeah, because the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, having to go through BC back down. So I think that's originally why they wanted to bring it forth, right? As maybe a threat at that point in time. Tyler, an Alberta MP, got into a little bit of trouble recently and was threatened with being kicked out of the House of Commons. His offense? Wearing an I love oil and gas button, and that's against the rules on the Hill.
Yeah, so not specifically an Alberta legislature story, but I do try to keep my eye out for fun stuff happening in the world of Canadian politics. And that's right, Martin Shields, I believe the MP from down your way, had a "I love Canadian oil and gas" button on his lapel there, and the specific rule in the House of Commons is that you're not allowed to have props. So you can't have signs or anything like that. And it's come up a few times in the past. Reform Party MPs apparently used to bring little Canadian flags for their desks and were told they couldn't do that. So, he took the button off at the end of the day, and it didn't end up being an issue, but did cause, minor controversy with some other MPs saying that they have pins that they might like to wear as well, but it's against the rules, and so on and so forth. So off the pin came, and he was allowed to stay in the House.
That's bizarre, though, how you can't have a Canadian flag on your desk at the Canadian House of Parliament. Like, what? You can't have a Canadian flag.
It's very strange. That's true.
It is, yeah, it's kind of odd. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Al.